Sandro is a museum thinker and cultural strategist. He is very active as advisor and lecturer in museum studies at the University of Malta and other international institutions. Sandro Debono will talk about Museum Pandemonium. We are really curious about it. So Sandro, the floor is yours.
Yes.
Good.
Hello, Lana. Good afternoon, Georgia. Good afternoon, Europe. I'm Sandro Debono, and I'll be speaking about Museum Pandemonium. And as you rightly pointed out, questions about my choice of title, because Pandemonium is not a common word. In fact, I've chosen my word from John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is a piece of literature written in the 17th century. And Pandemonium is the capital of hell, essentially, and it's an old demon place. It's a place of confusion. It's a place of chaos. And I think that museums are very much at this juncture, at this point in time. I can sense that there is a bit of confusion, a bit of feeling helpless, a sense of helplessness, a sense of feeling lost. And in my brief presentation, I shall try to highlight some of the bearings, some of the challenges that museums are facing, which have also been mentioned by Sharon and others, but I'll be a bit more synthetic. So this is essentially what we're discussing about, what we're talking about, no? We're discussing about a museum idea, which is very much synthesized in this icon. Everywhere you go, anywhere you go, this is the sign that would usually tell you that there's a museum somewhere in the vicinity. It's a temple-like structure, which refers to temple of knowledge that museums have always been associated with. But in a way, we've taken it for granted that a museum should be like this and only like this. That they should be a temple of knowledge with a codes of behavior, with a way how to approach them, with a sense of ritual. I mean, it's all that is currently being put into question by the COVID-19 situation. And I'd like to explain this briefly by quoting a recent study published by Wilkening Consulting, which is working for the American Alliance of Museums. They're publishing these stories. I think this is story number 4. And Wilkening Consulting were actually asking museum goers whether they would miss a museum institution if it is no more. And in fact, the reaction was that museum goers did express grief, but there was little indication that museum goers will be supporting museum institutions. And I quote from what they actually wrote, I mean, what has been published, in the sense that if museums are needed, then that means that they might survive the COVID-19 situation, but they are not seen as vital. And if I can quote, if they cannot adapt, then they might not as well exist. Not all museums are important. This is the reaction of the American museum goers that we're getting in successive thought. I'd like just to quote two numbers, which represent 2 pieces of information, 2 statistics that have been collated in two different contexts. 75%. This is the number of respondents to the NEMO survey, which Julia has been mentioning a few minutes ago, which are not considering alternative financing models. This data, this sheet refers to the NEMO survey. It is the answer to the question that you can see at the top. What changes do you foresee in the long term? And the changes are certainly not about the museum closing, are certainly not about reconsidering the museum's existence, are not about downsizing, but museums are not considering alternative modes of funding. It seems that we're at a stalemate and we're expecting that things will go back to normal as they were a few weeks ago. This is the impression that this survey might be given. Obviously, we need to put in a disclaimer here. This data was compiled and published in May, around mid-May. So things might be changing slightly, but the trend seems to be indicative that we're still on course with this idea. 85%. This is another number and a figure which I'm quoting from a survey published by Art Fund in the UK. And 85% refer to practically the percentage of museum directors in the UK who are concerned that they will not have the ability to attract visitors back. If you look at this chart, at this data, the one that tops the list, is at the top of the list, is precisely this concern. Museum directors are concerned that they will not be able to get back their audiences, which is in a way telling, because things have changed quite substantially over the past few weeks, few months. We have museum netizens who have experienced museums online. We have audiences that have looked for museums, that have experienced products that museums have put in spite of the chaotic circumstances. At one point, it felt as if things were getting funneled and everything was getting blocked with so much content being thrown at such short notice. So how are things going at this point in time? With museums slowly reopening, with museums leaving their doors ajar to invite people back in, and people will not be coming in, as we were hearing from other speakers, in the immediate, but is going to be in the medium to long term, then what type of relationship do we need to foster with our communities? How do our communities actually understand or imagine that we are, or what do we stand for? I mean, this dialectic between museums and community seems to be a possible way forward. But it's interesting to note how people look at museums. And I didn't go for the official ICOM definition. I just tried to Google and see what people understand, what the net understands with the word museum. And if you can follow my slide, a museum on the net is described as a building in which objects of historical, scientific, artistic, or cultural interest are stored and exhibited. This is very much the traditional museum. This is very much what was mainstream, what was considered as the only form of museum pre-COVID. Is this the same museum? I think it's not. I think we are changing. What about community then? I tried also to look for a definition just by looking at the net, just by searching on the net. And the first definition, number one, is a group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic in common. Well, actually, we are also a group of people who are in the same place and who have a particular characteristic in common, us as panelists and the participants to this conference, but we're not living in the same place. We're on the internet, we're on the net. Perhaps the number two is closer to what we might be experiencing now, because it's about the condition of sharing or having certain attitudes and interests in common. And I think we do have that. So even the net is still not reacting to the realities that we are living at this point in time. And perhaps museums, who are usually a bit slower in spite of the resilience, extraordinary resilience that they are showing and that they have shown to react to circumstances that came all of a sudden, might still not be understanding clearly. There is a dialectic between museums and communities, which might need to be seen through an appropriate lens. And I think that at this point in time, museums need bearings. They need to understand where they should be heading, what are the values that really matter at this point in time, and how to move and how to adjust and how to align each and every institution to those values. And I've taken the COVID situation to come up with my R factor. We've talked about the R factor, which means that in the COVID-19 situation, the higher the R factor, the risks would be higher. And obviously governments were working hard to lower the R factor and keep it under control. I think museums also have an R factor, but it is of a different nature. It is a triple R factor. All three R's are connected. It's not a negative R factor. I think museums should be ambitious enough to look forward to increase this R factor, but these three R's need to work together. It's an R factor, which is to the power of 3, or a triad, a tripod type of factor, which could determine the way forward for museums in the coming weeks and months. And I'll just highlight the 3 of them. Resilience, that's a big R, and I think point. Museums have been struggling. What has been for granted, what has been taken for granted, what was there, untouchable, available without any questions asked, is no more. And it's a question of getting people to start in a way from scratch, to look back at how your operations would have functioned a few weeks ago, and through an elastic approach and trying to be as flexible as possible, there is the need for museums to think laterally. It's not a question of the way things were working, working according to the model. We tend to define a practice and stick to it. The human mind is sometimes blocked in a certain way, in a certain pattern. We need to literally think laterally, look at things differently, and try to come up with new processes. And I think this is the situation that museum directors are feeling at this point in time. They're trying to literally hold a huge stone from crashing a fragile institution. I think that in this case, small museums are best equipped to be as resilient as possible, because in a small museum, a museum director would be flexible. He would not have the resources. He would need to reinvent and to look at and to find ways and means how to get his institution moving forward. He would be accustomed to dealing with projects through an in-kind approach, with finding bits and pieces of sponsorship, with getting free support, with getting all sorts of assistance together as much as possible. So I think small museums, in a way, small is beautiful. And I think small museums are best equipped to actually teach us a lot about resilience. I'm not saying just small museums. There are also areas of conflict where there is a lot of things that we can learn, the way communities were resilient enough to weather storms, sometimes even war. So the information is there. It's just a question of looking for it and trying to understand what works best for you. The second R is relevance. And relevance is very much about understanding what your community wants and how your museum can actually function and be relevant for your community. There is this dialectic that has sometimes been put aside, pushed aside. Smaller museums are also a bit more aware of this dialectic because they are not within the mainstream tourism areas, so they would be trying to find ways and means how they can actually be relevant to specific communities, but it's not anymore about small communities. As we were referring to the Wilkening research at the beginning of my presentation, it's very much about understanding really how museums can matter, how we can matter. And this is exactly what I was talking about, no? Trying to involve, trying to reach out, trying to speak a language that people can understand, trying to come up with programming, trying to come up with all sorts of outreach programs that people can feel comfortable, that they would not feel excluded, and that they would actually consider the museum as their natural habitat. The third R is the sum total of the three things. If you don't have resilience and you are not relevant, it is very difficult for you to get the revenue. And this is a very important tripod. The three things have to work together. It's a triad. If you're not resilient, you're going to be very difficult with being relevant. You're going to find difficulties with being relevant. And if you're not relevant, people will not put the money in your institution. How can this be done? You probably have recognized this guy, that's Harry Potter. And I want to choose Harry Potter as my example to explain how museums can actually reinvent themselves in a new world, in a post-COVID world. Harry Potter is not just the books. Well, it's 7 books, not just 1 book. But it's also 8 films, it's an amusement park, it's a web-based newspaper, it is merchandise, it's Lego, and it's much, much more. There are museums who are not feeling comfortable with the digital because sometimes they understand the digital as being something in competition. And it's not just museums. A few weeks ago, the CEO of Opera Australia actually commented that the digital might be a threat because if we invest too much on the digital and if we produce high quality content on the digital, then that will come back to haunt us. So it's not just the museum world. There are CEOs out there, there are institutions out there who are not yet comfortable with the digital. The museum can actually reinvent itself in different media. I mean, one of the games we used to play when we were young was about trying to ask ourselves, if you were a toy, what would you be? If I was an animal, what would you be? And I think museums can actually ask this question. If I wasn't an institution, a physical space, what could I be? The risk is that we replicate what the physical experience is, and I think this is part of the letdown that virtual museums have been, that virtual tours have been experiencing, because it's a replica, it's a copy paste of the physical experience. But on the other hand, there is much more potential for the digital to evolve into something completely new. It is a complementary, it's a universe, it's the museum universe, and it could actually be accessed with 1 ticket. You can actually have 1 ticket to access the physical museum along with all the services. It might, at first, it might be just a question of giving value to the physical experience, but then people would actually learn how to experience the digital as a complementary. You can actually have an exhibition which is physical, but which is also digital, or which continues into the digital. We're talking about transmedia storytelling. We're talking about convergence culture that Henry Jenkins actually wrote about starting from 2003. All the research, all the needs that museums might be looking for are there. The research is there. The experiments are there. What is happening is just a question of accelerating this need because of the COVID-19 situation. As we say in English, every cloud has a silver lining. And I live in the hope that this situation is also a silver lining for museums to grow and to develop into something extraordinary, more than they are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandro. How do you define relevance? How can a museum become relevant? It is a question for Sandro.
That is a very good question. I mean, it's such an interesting topic that the best book I could recommend is The Art of Relevance by Nina Simon. But relevance, it's a question of reaching out, of sitting next to your audience, of having conversations with your audience, of having conversation with your community rather than your audiences, especially those people who don't turn out, who don't come to visit your museum, who are part of the community, and to understand how you can actually communicate such a complex idea, which is the museum, in very simple terms. And if they feel that they are comfortable, if they feel that you can help them break the ice, by making things simple for them, by helping them to acknowledge, for example, art as a resource, then people will come. This is an experiment that Nina Simon has conducted. It's not just Nina Simon, there are many others who have worked on relevance. And it's not easy, it's a lengthy process, but it can be done.
there are many discussions after and during pandemic about do the museums have to reimagine the exhibition concepts or topics after pandemic. So the people are interested. What do you think about it?
I think that the blockbuster exhibition has been in crisis for, I mean, in crisis, I'm using it very broad here, for the past 8 years. I mean, it's a very complex project. It's very time consuming. It's expensive. It's expensive. I mean, there are case studies. I mean, dating back to the Tate with particular exhibitions when the crowds could not make possible a proper visit. And there are companies who are looking into lightweight versions of traveling exhibitions, for example. There are institutions who have been presenting COVID-19 related exhibitions. The National Museum of the Czech Republic has presented an exhibition of masks a few weeks ago. There is the COVID-19 museum, yes, online. It's an Instagram account. However, it's not a proper museum. So I don't want to go into the definition there because it is a bit tricky at this point in time. But I mean, it's a question of relevance at the end of the day. If you want to be relevant, what is your community interested in? And if by understanding how, and I think there was an Nemo webinar in recent a few weeks ago about this topic. I mean, it's a question of understanding what your audience is after, what your public is after, what your community is interested in, and trying to come up with a project, perhaps jointly with your community, which would increase your relevance in the eyes of your community.
Thank you, Sandra.